Welcome to today's webinar, Making Democracy Work, Election Administration Legislation 2017 webinar, brought to you by NCSL. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Patrick Potyondy. The floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. This is Patrick Potyondy, and I'm here with Wendy Underhill and also Dylan Lynch, part of our elections team here at NCSL. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar of Elections Administration Legislation of 2017. So I'm just going to kind of introduce how this is going to work and our topic today for us quickly, and then we'll be diving into the material here pretty soon. And so here's a quick outline of what we're going to look at today. We're going to do some quick housekeeping. Then we're going to talk about a couple of the big themes for 2017. Then we're going to dive into some specific topics, election administration legislation topics. And then take maybe a little quick stab throughout, and then also at the end, what's coming in 2018. And we'd also like to hear from all of our participants on what they see coming in 2018, especially at the end. We'll have some dedicated time to that. So give that some thought as we're going along. But throughout the entire process, definitely feel free to ask us questions. And you can see on your screen, you should be able to see a chat box there where you'll be able to type in questions at any time. And either Wendy or myself or Dylan will be looking out for those and asking those aloud to the group if and when we can address those. So keep in mind there, and that's also how you'll be able to give us your ideas about what you see coming in 2018 when we get to that point. So quickly here, we just wanted to point out some NCSL resources to you. We have our website, ncsl.org/elections. We have our kind of flagship newsletter, the Canvas. We just had our recent issue for January 2018 go out a little while ago, so be sure to check that out. There's some really good stuff on there. We have, on top of a little review of 2017 legislation itself, we also have an essay on breaking ties, and our usual interviews with an elections chair and elections administrator, so be sure to check those out. We also have our election legislation database, which can be really useful for keeping track of that or looking back all the way to 2011 to see what was passed. And here you can see the elections team here, Wendy, who is with me, Dylan, who's with me, and then also Beth Hladnick, who's not here today, but is always also able to help us out with any of your info requests or anything you'd like to know about. So we just wanted to start off with a general map here, and it'll also give you kind of a taste of some of the types of maps we're going to look at. This is the hexagonal map, and so some states are in places that don't quite seem to maybe make sense, but it gives us a really good count and an even visual to look at. So also places like Delaware and D.C. for once get to be as big as Alaska and Texas, so it kind of evens that playing field a little bit. But this will also give you a sense here of the color coding we're going to use for a lot of the maps for the legislation. Orange is going to denote past states that passed legislation on that topic, and purple will be states that just introduced bills on that topic. And so if you are looking for a couple states, you can take a chance here to take a look and see that, Idaho, for example, is now on the coast, given how this map kind of lays things out. But we also wanted to show this map of here we have the 50 states plus D.C. is how we're counting legislation today. Every state in the United States and plus D.C. have introduced a bill, and the vast majority, 42 of those, have enacted legislation. And this really kind of gives also a sense of this kind of underpinnings of democracy here. This is how democracy actually functions. We like to debate all sorts of other policy issues here at NCSL, but elections kind of, without those, we don't really get anywhere else. And so we wanted to spend some time today reviewing those in 2017. Here's some kind of overview of what's going on here this last year. Total election bills introduced, over 2,300. We had 267 bills enacted. Again, as I mentioned, 50 states plus D.C., so total 51 introduced a bill, 42 enacted legislation, and that comes out to an average of about 46.5 bills, or 6 bills per state. 46.5 bills introduced per state, 6 bills enacted. Big issues of 2017, that's what we're about to get to. And then big issues in 2018, we're going to take our best shot, but we'd like your help on that towards the end here. So quickly, just remember here that some of the bills that we're going to tally as we go through the topics, as we're just about to go on, might be tallied twice, which is to say one elections bill can deal with many topics, and those, so a bill might deal with elections technology as well as vote centers, for example, things like that. And then also when we just say states, we're meaning those 50+1, that DC category as well, and that, that a great variety of variation can exist between those. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Wendy to kind of start us off here looking at our specific topics.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I don't know if you all have met Patrick before. He's been with us for about 6 months now, and he's actually been quite amazing. He's taking over all of our census work, our ballot measures work, our initiative and referendum process work, and in addition, he did virtually all of the work to put this presentation together for you today. So you can just do a silent applause for him on what he's produced so far. I do also want to say that on the Canvas, which you probably know I love dearly, it's going to come up on its 10-year anniversary in April. So I don't know how we're celebrating, but I'm pretty excited about that.
We're trying to think of some good stuff.
Yeah, and ideas are welcome. All right, so the first slide, would you go ahead and shift? Oh yeah, I can see that I've got a little delay here. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so now you can see a slide that was taken by Patrick when he and I had the opportunity to visit in San Diego, the election office with Michael Zhu, who's the director there. And he has these signs up on his wall, and each one is an I voted sticker, and it's in a different language that they support in San Diego. So it's not just Spanish, it's not just Spanish and Chinese, there's Filipino and Vietnamese and a number of other languages up there. And he was thinking ahead. He left 2 blank slides or signs that he can fill in as additional languages come. Just kind of a fun piece to think about for the future, kind of a sign of the times, you might say. So I have done a bunch of talks in the last 5 years, and I've started virtually every single one of them talking about voter ID. And I'm mixing that up today. This is a big shift, and that's because security is the key word for elections in 2017, and I would guess that would be true in 2018 as well. And that shift to security comes in part because of concerns about Russian interference, or we might even say any interference, in the 2016 election, which was primarily on the campaign side of things, not the election administration side. The general public doesn't make that distinction. There are also a few isolated incidents when voter registration rolls were tapped by intruders, and it's my understanding that no data was actually changed or deleted or interfered with in other ways, but still that certainly brought it to everyone's attention that security has got to be at the top of our list. It is really hard to write a bill that says we will have secure elections. You have to be more explicit. You have to operationalize that idea, and so that's some of what we're going to talk about as we go forward. So this slide has the number of bills that were introduced on election technology, 101, and there were 20 that were enacted. Go ahead and show the map there too. They were all across the board. All kinds of different things were considered. I know that in Arkansas they were looking at setting a date for logic and accuracy testing, for instance, and in Mississippi they dealt with their central voter registration system. But the real big issue we're going to get to in the next slide is election funding. And I'll just say here that when you're talking about elections funding, mostly we're thinking about the equipment that people on or the scanners that read ballots, but it also could refer to the statewide voter registration databases, and maybe we're going to see more of that as we go into the next couple of years. Those databases were primarily developed in the mid-2000s, and they need overhauls or revamping or perhaps replacement in many states, and there is a price tag associated with that. We don't see a lot of legislation on it, and it probably comes through Secretary of State's budgets, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. All right, so in terms of the, go back one. So in terms of paying for the equipment itself, that is the number one thing that states are thinking about when they're thinking about technology. And the questions are who's going to pay and what choices are they going to make? The common ground in the choices that have been made recently is that paper ballots are a definite trend. And if we extended it to those that have a paper trail, then I think we could say all of the purchases that have been made recently have included that. And what's new is that states are thinking about how they can help fund. So if you go back before the year 2000, it was primarily a local function to support elections, and that included buying the technology. Then in 2002, with the Help America Vote Act, federal money was infused into the system. And now when it's time to replace yet again, the question is who's going to pay for it? And locals are looking to states for help. And some states, like those that we have on the screen here, are in fact helping. Michigan put in $10 million of straight appropriation with $30 million of leftover HAVA funds. Nevada put in $8 million, which should cover a good portion, if not all, of what they need. Minnesota has $7 million in the pot, and that includes 3/4 of the funding required for jurisdictions that want to use electronic poll books, and 50% for states that are going to swap, or excuse me, counties that are going to swap out their voting equipment itself. And Utah put in $275,000 will be distributed to the counties. Iowa established a loan fund, but to the best of my knowledge, there's no money yet in it, but that might be coming. And then I did put Ohio and California on as possibilities in 2018. I know both states have proposals to put in significant funding. I won't make a guess as to whether they will actually pass those bills with many millions of dollars associated with it. So it's one thing to say how much is it going to cost, but it's another thing to say how you're going to get that money. I will say that option number one could be that the county pays, as has been tradition, optional. Option number two could be that the state pays, and there are states where they take that role very seriously. New Mexico, for instance, paid the full price at the state level in 2014. You can split the costs, and Maryland has done that. You can lease the equipment to bring down the annual cost for it. You can establish a revolving fund that would probably be held under the Secretary of State's office, and the counties could borrow from it and then repay it over time. And in a couple of states, there are dedicated fees from services that Secretaries of State provide, and the money that's associated with that can be put in a fund for technology. And then you can pass bonds, and that does happen on the local level. I don't believe it's yet ever been done at the state level, although California talked about it. And Patrick made me put in, you could wait for the feds. There is a Senate bill right now that would...
And it's a bipartisan bill.
Thank you, thank you. And so it could be that given the increased interest in funding for technology, that bill might pass. We'll just have to wait.
We'll see, yeah. Exactly.
Okay, great. And then we discussed whether voting accessibility belonged in the portion on security and technology or if it belonged elsewhere, and whatever. Here it is. 35 million people in the United States have some form of a disability, and those of us who think of ourselves as able-bodied are all aging, and cognitive and physical disabilities are likely in our future. The GAO, there are federal requirements for people with disabilities to be able to vote independently and privately. And the GAO looked at this in a report from last year, and it's well worth reading. You can have a law, but it's another thing to have it implemented in every nook and cranny of the nation. They did find that of the polling places that they looked at, only 17% were up to snuff. A little bit of a surprise. So New Mexico is a state we can look at that has taken some action on this, and that was last year. It passed a bill that will require the Secretary of State to create ways for people with visual impairment to be able to vote remotely, and we'll see what that looks like. And I know that that's oftentimes seen as on a continuum of values. One is access for people with disabilities, and another is security, and we'll be watching carefully how they implement that. Okay. Now we get to the familiar terrain for me and probably for most of you out there too. Voter ID saw 113 bills introduced and 6 enacted. And you can see, again, I'll remind you that purple means they had a bill introduced, and orange means that it was enacted. So lots more enactments than there were, lots more introductions than there were enactments.
And Wendy, it seems like there's, a lot of bills introduced here, but not necessarily a lot of enactments to go along with it. And do you think this topic maybe plateaued a bit? Has it kind of reached a peak of a type here for this topic?
I had sort of said it peaked in 2015, and here we are 2017 with 6 enactments. So I'm going to say that's still a significant amount. But if you could just go to the next slide, I think I can answer your question better there. These are the states where there is some form of voter ID in the law now. And so you can see it's almost all of the states have it. So to some extent, you would expect action to slow down. And another thing we can say is some of that action that we saw was not just about whether you should or you shouldn't have a voter ID law. It was what kinds of IDs should be used or will be considered, and tweaks around the edges of it. So would you go back now to the other one?
Yes.
So I do want to say that on the voter ID bills from this last year, ones that were significant were North Dakota and Texas. Those are two states that have had voter ID laws on the books for quite some time. They've been challenged in the courts repeatedly, and these were amendments to presumably make them constitutional in regard to the courts in those two states. Arkansas had a new bill this year, and it too had a bill like this in 2013 that was struck down under its state constitution, and it came back this year with this new bill which has been enacted. And just to be double sure, the legislature sent to the people for a vote in 2018 a constitutional amendment that would enshrine voter identification in the Constitution. So I don't know how that will come out. And then I think Iowa actually gets the title of the most significant bill on voter ID from 2017, and that bill is the first in that state, and it included not only the requirement that you show something when you go to the polls, but that the state take the responsibility for mailing out a voter ID to the voters who don't already have a state driver's license or state ID card. So we're going to be watching how that works in Iowa and whether that protects it from court cases. Okay, now we can go on.
Oh, and just to underline how much activity there was on this topic, Texas had 22 bills introduced on voter ID alone, and Virginia had something like 12. And so there is a lot of continued discussion on this topic, even as, I asked a question about how many enactments there were.
Great. All right, so now we're going to talk about the other big issue that we've been discussing for years and years and years, and that's pre-election day voting. And by the way, Patrick, in the future, I'm going to really try to hone in on pre-election day voting as the title for this kind of a thing. This was a really big deal between 2000 and 2010, and that's because more states were adopting options for people to vote before Election Day. But as you can see on this slide, almost all the states, all of those in blue, already provide a pre-election day voting opportunity for their voters. And that leaves 12 that are in green that don't. And we do see legislation out of at least Mississippi and Michigan and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania this year. I can't promise whether it's going to go through or not, but of those last 12, I'm seeing some interest. So this is kind of this one might be peaked like you asked before. This one might be peaked.
Okay.
And here's the bills, 84 introduced and 13 enacted. So you might wonder, if I've just told you it peaked, how did we get all of these bills? Well, the conversation has shifted from talking about whether people should be able to vote before Election Day and whether they would do that with an absentee ballot or early in-person voting, to how will the procedures, particularly for the absentee ballots, be tweaked. So when there weren't very many people who voted by absentee, you got your ballot, you returned it. Now more than a third of the voters in the United States do use some form of pre-election day voting. Many of them are using a paper ballot that they turn back in. So what are the requirements for when it's received? What are the requirements for postpaid or putting postage on it if you can mail it in? What are the requirements for an affidavit signed along with it? So it's those procedural pieces that you might say come after the fact. And let's go to AllMale elections. This is one subset of what we just talked about. AllMale elections are states that you could argue that all of the voters are absentee voters. So in these states, at least the three that are in blue, all registered voters are mailed a ballot to their home. And I've got Utah and California there too, because the counties have the option of going that way. And in Utah, virtually all the counties did do that in 2016. I don't yet know how California counties will do that this year, but I'm thinking of those two as the all-mail light states, and we'll see how that goes. I think go ahead and...
And I'll just also note here, too, that if any questions pop up, feel free to stick them in that chat box for us, and we'll address them as we go along, or you can put them in at the end.
So I've been using the phrase all-mail elections. Other people call it vote by mail, and the new phrase I've just heard is vote at home, or voting at home. And the reason that that organization, and I think you can Google that if you want to, uses vote at home is that when we think about vote by mail, that would sound as though you mail a ballot out and you mail a ballot back. Well, you can do that, but most of us in Colorado do what you see here in this picture. We receive a ballot by mail, but then we take it by bike or car or whatever and drop it off at a location. So,
and I can attest that, yeah, when I moved back here to Colorado recently, and I voted in Colorado, here, and the first time in this all-male election, what I did is I dropped it off at a box that was set, and so that's exactly how I did it.
So male is kind of a mistaken way to refer to this to some extent. We get a shocking number of questions about this, so think about that. We've put up vote centers here too. This isn't quite so major a change as moving to all-male elections would be, but this is where there are fewer but larger in-person polling places on election day. And they're larger because you have allowed everyone in the county to vote at any one of these vote centers that might be of convenience for them, so at close to their home, close to their work, whatever it might be. There are also the option of super precincts or multi-precinct centers, and that's used in some states, and that will get you some of the cost savings and some of the savings on the particularly hard effort to get enough poll workers to staff your operations. So those are out there too. But the bills that we saw this time in California and Utah and Nevada were primarily related to all-male elections, but continuing to have vote centers, and in Nevada to ensure that there's a vote center on every Native American reservation.
And for any folks who want to really go deeper into vote centers too, if those interest you, there's some really interesting research that's been done on creating trust among infrequent voters who then use vote centers and then possibly becoming more frequent voters. And so that's kind of an interesting, some research that's been going on there.
All right, we're now on registration, and we have 5 slides on registration altogether, and that's because registration truly is the foundation on which good elections are built. So it makes sense that if you believe the foundation keeps the rest of it sturdy, then you want to put your efforts in on that, and we see people in all states of both political parties showing a great deal of interest in voter lists and voter registration in general. This slide just simply says that Nevada and Oregon joined 14 other states that allow students who are as young as 16 or sometimes 17 to register to vote, and that helps because then when they go to get their driver's license, you can also catch them for voter registration at the same time.
And does this category also capture those states where you let someone who's under 18 vote in a primary if they're going to be 18 by the time they get to vote in the regular election?
No, actually it doesn't. We do have information on that if anybody wants it, on which states allow people who are going to be 18 by the general to vote in the primary, but this list is, and we do have a web page on this that will tell you all the other 14, but it's a different list for that one. You got to call it.
Okay, perfect.
Next on the registration list is automatic registration, and in 2017, Colorado, Illinois, and Rhode Island joined the 6 other states that we had categorized as already having it. Colorado did so through administrative rule, and Illinois and Rhode Island did it through legislation. Illinois was a bipartisan effort and would be an interesting model to look at if any other states are thinking about going that way.
And this topic seems similarly complicated. How has NCSL gone about defining this topic? We get a lot of info requests on this topic, and a lot of them have to do with definitions and which states are included and which states aren't. So how have we done that here at NCSL?
Well, now you are asking the million-dollar question. Our rule at NCSL is that if a legislature or the state says they have automatic voter registration, then we say they have automatic voter registration. There is a different way to categorize, and that would be ones where there's an opt-out feature. That would be Oregon, where you get put on the list and then you have to take an action to get off the list, as opposed to opt-in, which is all of the other states, I'm fairly sure I'm right on that, where when you're at the DMV transacting business, you have to check a box and say, yes, I want to be registered, but you can't complete your transaction without that. So it's a question that a lot of good minds in the election world are considering. What's automatic, what's automated, what's just modernized motor voter? Registration list use. Now, there were 46 bills on this and 6 enactments, which is a pretty good number. And you probably are all thinking that the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity is what spawned all of this legislation, and that is incorrect. There were a few bills on that, but the PACE came into being in the summer, at which point most legislatures were already out. So what we saw here is an ongoing interest in states on how lists can be distributed, to whom, for what price. And I'm going to just say we skip over that. If people, any further, if people want more on that, we can talk about it. But that takes us to list maintenance. And there were 119 bills with 21 enactments, which makes this the bell ringer. I think this is the most enactments of any of the topics that we've got.
Definitely, especially, and if we split these categories apart, but if you add these categories together, you get a huge, by far, registration list maintenance is already the top introduced category, but if you combine that with our other registration list category there, you get something like 157 bills total introduced, by far dwarfing our other topics.
So hint for the future, we should expect more on voter list maintenance and voter list use. I will just go over a few of these. One of them out of New Hampshire requires the state to investigate if a letter that they send out about a registration was undeliverable. Then the state is required now to go out and investigate that. In Utah, they passed a law that allows voters to be put on an inactive list if a mailed notice is returned, rather than removing that voter from the list altogether. California is now sending texts to voters who did that pre-registration, so trying to hit those teens where they live with text. Delaware is now permitting its election department to use evidence that a voter has obtained a driver's license elsewhere in another state to trigger removal from the list. And I don't mean necessarily removing, but triggering the system to remove them. And Tennessee spelled out ways that its list could be checked with the National Change of Address or by comparing voter lists with the DMV. I will also add that in 2017, the Electronic Registration Information Center had Arizona join, and then actually in January already this year, Missouri has joined. And if you're not familiar with the Electronic Registration Information Center, otherwise known as ERIC, it's a consortium of states where their voter registration database is checked against each other, and then they get reports, and then it's up to the states how they want to handle those reports. And this slide that Patrick made for me makes the case that list maintenance is becoming more and more important with the 21 bills we saw in this year, but you can see that it's been an uptick since 2014. Let's change pace a little bit and go to voting rights for people who have felony convictions. This is a perennial topic for us. The thing I'll say about this is that there's a lot of bills and just a few enactments, the ones in orange here. And all of the enactments this year, and almost all of the enactments over the last 10 years, have moved in the direction of returning the right to vote earlier in the correction process. So it's not entirely a one-way stream, but pretty close. And on this topic, I will say that in Florida, citizens have put a measure onto the ballot that for the voters to vote on, which would be a constitutional amendment that would allow felons to have their voting rights removed when they're done with their sentence. And in Florida, it takes 60% to pass a constitutional amendment. That's a pretty high bar. We'll be watching later on to see if that comes to pass. Now, post-election audits, usually when I say that, people's eyes start to droop a little bit, not the coolest topic, and yet it is a huge topic. And if you haven't had bills in your state on post-election audits, I would suggest that you might easily have them this year. We had several enactments. Remember, I mentioned that Iowa bill on voter ID. It also included a post-election audit requirement. And Virginia and Rhode Island are on here. They did risk-limiting post-election audits, which might sound even sleepier than just plain post-election audits.
Or more exciting.
If you're a mathematician, more exciting. Let's go to the next slide because that's fun. So here is Secretary of State Wayne Williams from Colorado at the first ever Colorado risk limiting audit event, and they had people come in from all over the nation in the fall to see this. And what I'm amused by here is that it's a very fancy algorithm and a system that was developed with a great deal of math skill, and yet they're using these 10-sided dies to kick it off. So low-tech meets high-tech for risk-limiting audits. And here, too, if you want more on this, we have lots more behind the scenes, and we expect that Dylan's going to be working on that this springtime. So do come to us if there's more you'd like on that topic. Now, task forces, let's go ahead and show them. there are people who think the task forces are where ideas are sent to die, and I am not in that group. I love task forces, and I especially love task forces when they relate to elections, because it gives you a chance for a topic that's complicated and confusing and has stakeholders with different perspectives to come together and talk it out a little more slowly than through the regular hearing and enactment process. So just quickly, North Dakota is looking during its interim at election dates and whether consolidating them would provide savings and perhaps increase turnout. And that's a topic that we don't have a lot on the web about, but we do have some stuff behind the scenes. Wyoming, the Secretary of State, has a task force on elections technology. New Mexico had one, did its work, and now they've got an RFP and are making and have made a choice on what's the best equipment. New Mexico's secretary has a task force on voting rights for African Americans. No, for Native Americans.
Yes.
Yeah. And Texas has a technology one that's just getting off the ground. So let's just go with that. Whew. Okay, now Patrick, I've done all the talking so far, so now it's your turn.
All right, I'll pick this up from here. So ranked choice voting on one hand, it's a somewhat niche topic, right? But it seems to be kind of growing in popularity here. It's got a fair amount of attention this last year with 36 bills introduced in 18 states, and you can see Maine up there with the one enacted bill trying to kind of figure out its constitutional problem with having passed a measure to do statewide RCV in that state. And this is something that we're seeing a continued interest here in 2018. A number of states have carried over bills that haven't necessarily fully died yet and may get some continued interest. But then in 2018, we've seen some new introductions as well in Missouri, New Hampshire for statewide, Virginia as well. New Jersey, New York, and Utah either have local or pilot ranked choice voting bills here for their state. And we also see electioneering here we want to take a look at. We saw 29 bills introduced and 7 enacted. Electioneering can encompass a lot of different specifics depending on where you're at. This, what we're particularly interested in here are the requirements that you stay a certain distance away from a polling place and don't partake in what's called electioneering activity, that is advocating for political parties or candidates, or certainly not intimidating other voters, those sorts of concerns. So this category, though, also includes bills, about where you can put campaign signs, not necessarily just next to polling places, but in other places like billboards and things like that. And one reason this is of interest to me is I've kind of gotten overly nerdy about the upcoming Supreme Court case, Minnesota Voters Alliance v. Mansky, where this deals with electioneering laws in Minnesota and issues surrounding free speech. And one of the briefs in the case notes that at least 8 other states, and we know of one other, that include this sort of ban on what is kind of considered by some political speech near polling places, but how much of a ban or what kinds of limitations can you put on those is what the Supreme Court's going to take a look at. And there's a great NASS resource on state electioneering laws dated August 2016 here that we've linked to that you can take a look at as well, that has electioneering statutes in other states. So this Supreme Court case is dealing specifically with apparel, but there does seem to be some other electioneering laws that may apply to apparel depending on how they're interpreted. We also want to take a quick look at the national popular vote. As you can see, there were lots of bills introduced, relatively lots of bills introduced on this topic, but you will see a big fat 0 there under the enactments. And one might pose the question, right? Why is this? When Wendy and I were thinking about that.
We might also pose the question, why did we add it if no one's making action on it?
Exactly. You might, but it's an interesting topic. And so you can see here as the status of the national popular vote, and while it's not a perfect alignment, you can kind of see what some of these states look like in terms of political makeup of who's already passed this. And so it's something, 165 electoral votes have been dedicated to this already. They would need another 105 for this National Popular Vote Pact to take effect. Oregon has taken up this issue in 2018, for example. Their legislature makeup has changed a bit in a somewhat complicated way that we won't go into here, but has changed a bit to make passage of that a little more likely, but they would still need something like 98 electoral votes to get there. So maybe something of interest to kind of keep an eye on down the road.
I'll just throw in there, Patrick, that a wise man, Doug Lewis, told me once that the minute you get close to the required number, then some states will start to back out.
Ooh, that will be interesting to watch, too.
We got a ways to go before we see it in action.
And so here we want to just give a couple graphs. And so we have a question here on from Brian. Could you explain how the national popular vote works? And so this is an agreement among states that have passed these bills or sometimes resolutions to essentially, once they will give their electoral votes to the presidential candidate who wins the popular vote.
Of the nation, not
of the nation, whether or not that candidate won their state's popular vote, right, or electoral college vote, right? And so it's a way to bypass or get around the electoral college system. And this is, interest continues. We've had many previous elections to this one, then not just this 2016 election, where the popular vote did not necessarily align with the electoral college. And so that's where some of this continued interest is coming from. And so the agreement really only takes effect when you get over the threshold needed to win the electoral college. So until then, their electoral college votes go to the presidential candidate who won their state. But if they were to reach that threshold, then those statutes would kick in. And so hopefully I've answered that for Brian. Perfect. And so we also then here on our next slide wanted to give you a couple graphs here, just kind of comparing most of the topics we've talked about today in terms of this one showing election legislation introduced in blue, in the kind of blue-purple, and then in the orange, enacted. And this is legislation. And here we have it by states. So states introduced on the left of the most, and then with states enacted in orange next to each topic. And since you can download the PowerPoint here at that play button at the top of your screen, you can kind of take a closer look at those when you'd like. And so here we have some time left, so luckily we paced ourselves well, to take a look at maybe what we're thinking is coming down the pike or pipeline here in 2018. And we would love for folks to give us suggestions. And while we're doing that, we also have some other kind of info while people are still thinking about that.
Thanks, Patrick, and I do hope we'll get some questions from you all. While you're thinking about your question and typing it in, I'll tell you that the way we use that information is to help us figure out what is the important stuff for us to be investigating this year and what we would be writing about this year. And if you like what we've been talking about today, I will point out that the Canvas that came out about a week ago, it's the January issue of NCSL's The Canvas, talked about 2017 legislation. So that's kind of the cliff notes for what you've heard today. And then Patrick also made a webpage on that same material called 2017 Elections Legislation Enactments by State Legislatures. So that's something you could also look at, and that would give you the links to the bills that we've been discussing today.
And we've tried, especially on that webpage and also in the Canvas, we've kind of told you a little bit about each one and why we think it's maybe a little bit significant and why folks might be interested in it.
Right. Right. And then I know that many of you who are on the line are members of NCSL's Election Staff Network, and that means that you are staff in legislatures who deal with elections issues. And I want to reinforce for you that our job at NCSL is to provide assistance and research for you and for legislators, and actually for all legislative staff, not just the ones who are on the Election Staff Network. It's our bread and butter. So you are encouraged to ask us questions on anything at any point. We don't know all the answers, but we are here to do custom research for you when we don't have it, and we can help prepare for hearings or to provide written testimony or to provide in-person testimony. So I just want to encourage you to remember that we are a resource for you. The reason we exist is to do what you need to have done. So now tell us about what's going on in your states. I see, Justin, that you mentioned Tennessee, and I'm not sure if you want to tell us what you think is coming up there, or okay. One question we've got is can we put the website to the legislative enactments? Yes, we will post that in the resource box here. So I'm seeing that New Jersey and Virginia will have action on felony disenfranchisement this year. I'm trying to, other than the Florida one, it's unclear.
So the Florida one has the ballot measure that was a citizen initiative, but I also know the Florida legislature is also actually making moves to put measures on there as well. A couple that would re-enfranchise some folks. Well, you know, if you had certain convictions, you would still not be enfranchised there. But I know other states right now are coming to mind of who's also moving on this.
Miles, I'll say one more thing, and that's that all of the states that have the stricter requirements around returning voting rights tend to have bills every single year introduced. So I'm glad to see that you think that there could be action in New Jersey and Virginia. We'll track that. But I see the bills come up and then die fairly regularly, so I'm not sure how much action there will be. All right, we're going to give you all just a little bit more for a couple more questions.
Here, just a second.
There's more questions. We didn't see where they were. Hang on, we're getting there.
Oh, we have one on redistricting reform.
So, Lindsay, you're asking about redistricting reform and saying that an independent redistricting commission is likely to be on your ballot this year. Let's take that offline. There are quite a number of states, I'm going to say 8 states that might have it on their ballot this year. Some of those will fall through, some of them won't. We do have that backup, so if you can send me an email, I'll be happy to respond to that. So things are moving kind of quick here, so it's a little hard to see some of it. From March, we have, it looks like New Jersey is moving toward early voting centers and online registration. My thought about New Jersey is that with the shift in the governorship, we now have both houses of the legislature and the governorship in the hands of Democrats. So some things that that Governor Christie had been vetoing might go through more easily. So I can imagine that would be a state where we would see a lot of action.
And Mary Jo Daly had chatted earlier that redistricting reform is a hot topic in Pennsylvania due to the recent Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, and thinks that this will carry over to the next, after the 2020 census.
Okay, we got some more from Catherine Schilling. Says, are you familiar with votesmart.org? Who operates this, and do you use it? I am familiar with it, but I'm drawing a blank at this moment on votesmart.org. Would you look that up, and we'll see if we can answer that question? And Sherry in Montana is talking about technology for marking ballots for the people with disabilities. And I will be coming up there to talk about that in March. So that's an example of if you have a particular topic of interest in your state and you need a little more in-depth research done, we can do it and then we can come up and present it. So their question is what technology is on the market for people with disabilities both in the polling place and at home, and we will know a lot more about that a month from now. I'm looking to see.
Folks have other questions, or have we missed one? If we haven't addressed it.
What's that one? Are there any states exploring? Okay, so from Brian Eckert, are there any states exploring the use of doing the actual voting over the internet? And that question used to come up way more in 2012, 2013, and internet voting is not a very popular topic right now. We've seen so many times and places where banks and businesses and governments have all been hacked. So there's kind of a stop on that in general. An exception to that might be the remote balloting that we discussed in New Mexico for people with a visual impairment, and there's something similar in a couple of other states there too. And generally speaking, internet voting has been used for overseas voters, particularly military, and we do have a web page called Electronic Transmission of Ballots, which indicates where states are now. And this year I think we saw something out of Washington too, so Washington I think has a bill on that. You have to write these questions down.
And so Ron Bandes, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, there's a Pennsylvania Senate will hold a hearing on the final report of the cybersecurity issue of voting systems. Whoops, and the chat is being a little odd here.
I think that if you
can watch it live
there
tomorrow, I think you'll be able to scroll on your chat system and be able to watch that if you're interested in the Pennsylvania issues. Jay has asked what are some of the downsides of ranked choice voting. I've heard that the Green Party is rethinking their long-term support of it. I can't speak to the Green Party issue, but if you are interested in researching it more, we have more information you can write to us about, or you can check out the Ranked Choice Voting Center has some information, and so does Fair Vote. Both of those organizations are more pro-RCV than not, but they do give you a lot of information on it. One of the main downsides is you need to take a hard look at your state constitution to see if it's constitutional or not, and that's one of the main issues that places like Maine, but also other places like Tennessee have run into after trying to implement it.
I'll just jump in there, and you asked what are the downsides, so I'm going to stick on the downsides for this. One is that voters are unfamiliar with it. The places where they are using it, they say voters learn this plenty fast enough, but it is a change, and then your technology has to be able to support it, and I think most of the vendors out there are working on ranked choice voting systems that will accommodate that. But in the meantime, it's a good question to ask your administrators, can you do that or not?
Nick has a list of issues for Washington.
But you got to write them down. We can't see them.
There's a lot.
Give me one to go with then.
So he's talking about automatic voter registration, Voting Rights Act in Washington as well, which allows jurisdictions to go from at-large to within-district voting.
Okay, Nick, now I see yours. Thanks for writing. I'm going to take the easy ones first. Election Day voter registration. That's, I think, in operation in 15 states, and we have a good web page on which states those are and what's involved with that to make sure. There's a tech piece there. You want to make sure that if somebody's showing up at one polling place on Election Day and voting there, that they can't vote somewhere else. Presidential primary dates, always an interesting one, and so it looks like Washington will be thinking about that. And I know I did hear from someone else that Washington is very much thinking about the automatic voter registration there. And then the Voting Rights Act, I see you've given us the details. Okay, great. That's not something that comes up too often in the elections world, but certainly at-large versus district voting has been a huge issue for 20 years or more in redistricting. We're reading on to David Tessiter's, I'm sorry. Great, David, thank you for popping that in there. We will be reading that in, and we might be back to you for more details on how that goes. I'm going to say going once.
Any last questions? Well, all right. Well, thanks for joining us here today at our review of 2017 election administration legislation. Thanks for the great questions and pointers here at the end as well. If you have questions about any of the topics we've covered today or any other topics related to elections or redistricting, we're always here as a resource. You should definitely feel free to contact us. In this PowerPoint presentation, we've included some of our contact info, but you can also find that online. So feel free to reach out to us about any research topics or questions or clarifications or also corrections. Just like anyone else, we've been known to make mistakes as well. So if we missed something today, feel free to let us know. And so thanks very much for tuning in today.
Thank you. Thank you. This does conclude today's webinar. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time.